Tonight we enter a world almost never written by those who lived within it. Not the world of kings with their jewelled crowns and iron seals. Not the world of bishops, robed in silk, chanting beneath painted ceilings. Not the world of knights, flashing like fire beneath the sun as they rode beneath banners into legend. Tonight we go lower, down through the towers, beneath the castle walls, beyond the monastery libraries, past the carved tombs of the powerful, and into the wet fields, the smoky cottages, the hunger seasons, the lanes of mud, the long furrows cut into exhausted earth by human hands. Tonight we enter the hidden world of medieval peasants. For centuries our history looked away from them. It saw the lord in his hall, the warrior on his horse, the monk with his manuscript, the queen at her window, the saint in golden glass. But somewhere beyond all that grandeur, the vast majority of human beings lived and died with little more than a patched tunic, a wooden bowl, a strip of land, and the uncertain mercy of the weather. They left behind few words of their own. No great chronicles in their names, no epic poems sung for their grief, no marble statues raised above their graves. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. And yet they were there. They were always there. They were the hands that made the medieval world possible. They cleared the forests. They raised the barns. They cut the hay. They dug the ditches. They carried the stones that built the churches where others prayed for their souls. They sowed the grain that fed the armies. They brewed the ale that warmed the winter nights. They bore the children, buried the dead, mended the walls, turned the soil, and endured. To survive poverty in the Middle Ages was not simply to be poor. It was to live inside a fragile bargain with the earth itself. A bad harvest could become hunger. 2 bad harvests could become famine. A fever in spring could leave a field unploughed. A dead ox could ruin a family. A lord's fine, a failed crop, a storm at harvest, a child born weak, a cow gone barren, a roof leaking through the cold months. Each one could tilt a household toward disaster. But medieval peasants were not helpless shadows moving through misery. They were not simple fools trapped beneath superstition, as older histories sometimes imagined. They were practical, watchful, intelligent people, shaped by necessity into experts of survival. They knew the soil beneath their feet with a precision that few modern people can imagine. They knew which patch flooded first, which field held warmth, which trees gave nuts, which hedgerows hid berries, which herbs soothed pain, which neighbour might lend seed, which official could be avoided, which obligation could be delayed, and which silence might save a life. Their world was narrow, perhaps, but never empty. Listen, and there is sound everywhere. The creak of a wooden cart on a rutted lane, the dull strike of an axe into frozen timber, the cough of cattle in a byre, the hiss of rain on thatch, the murmur of prayer beside a child's bed, the bell from the parish church, breaking the morning dark, calling bodies from straw mattresses into another day of labour. Smoke hangs low beneath the cottage roof. Chickens scratch among the ashes. A pot of thin pottage steams above the hearth. Outside, the fields wait like a command. Most peasants live close to the edge, but that edge was not the same every day. Poverty was seasonal. It had a calendar. There were moments of relative fullness, especially after harvest, when grain sacks were heavier. Ale was brewed, animals were slaughtered, and feasting briefly pushed back fear. There were also the lean months, often in late winter and early spring, when stores ran low, bodies weakened, and the promise of the growing crop could be seen in the fields but not yet eaten. This was the hungry gap, when survival depended on calculation, memory, restraint, and luck. Archaeology gives us glimpses where written records fall silent. Stratigraphic excavation in deserted medieval villages reveals post holes of timber halls, sunken floors, hearth pits, drainage gullies, animal bones, broken pottery, iron tools, spindle whorls, and the ordinary debris of lives that once seemed lost beyond recovery. In churchyards, skeletal remains speak with a terrible honesty. Bones show hard labour. Teeth show grit from stone-ground flour. Spines bend with burden. Joints carry the marks of repetition. Childhood malnutrition appears in growth lines and enamel defects. Quiet signatures of hunger written into the body itself. These people lived in a world where the sacred and the practical were never truly separate. A field might be blessed. A storm might be feared as judgment. A saint might be asked to heal a cow, protect a child, or spare a village from sickness. The church calendar shaped time, but so did mud, frost, seed, lambing, harvest, rent day, and death. Heaven was real to them, but so was the tax collector. Hell was feared, but so was an empty granary. And all around them stood power. The manor was not only a place, it was a system. Land was divided, measured, owed, inherited, disputed, and watched. Some peasants were relatively free tenants. Others were villains, bound by custom to provide labour services and dues. They owed rent in grain, in coin, in chickens, in eggs, in days spent working the Lord's fields instead of their own. They owed payments for marriage, inheritance, milling grain, baking bread, brewing ale, using pasture, gathering wood, and sometimes even leaving the manor. Poverty was not merely lack, it was extraction. Yet within this world, peasants carved out spaces of agency. The village was a web of cooperation, resentment, obligation, and memory. Neighbours shared tools, exchanged labour, watched livestock, nursed the sick, accused one another, defended one another, and remembered everything. Common land could mean life. Woodland could provide fuel, nuts, berries, mushrooms, building material, and sometimes forbidden meat. Gleaning after harvest could add precious grain to a poor household store. A pig in the woods, a few hens near the doorway, a garden patch of leeks and beans. These small things mattered enormously. This is the story not of passive suffering, but of endurance sharpened into knowledge. It is easy to romanticize the medieval village as a lost world of simplicity, community, and honest labour beneath open skies. It is just as easy to flatten it into misery alone. Neither vision is enough. The truth lies somewhere more human and more difficult. Peasants sang, they gossiped, they stole, they prayed, they laughed at weddings, they feared childbirth, they drank too much ale, they mourned children, they argued over boundaries, they resented lords, they honoured saints, they watched the sky, they survived winters they had no guarantee of surviving. In the end, the hidden world of medieval peasants is not hidden because it was small. It is hidden because it was everywhere. It was so ordinary that the powerful rarely thought it worth recording, except when taxes were due, labour was demanded, or rebellion began to stir. But beneath the great events of medieval history, beneath crusades, coronations, dynastic wars, papal decrees, and castle sieges, there was always the same ancient struggle. A family around a hearth, a field beneath clouds, a hand reaching into the last grain sack, a prayer spoken into darkness. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we begin this long road through mud, hunger, faith, and survival, post your location and your local time down below. Somewhere in the world, another person is listening in the dark as we open the door to a cottage long vanished and step inside. A peasant child entered the world beneath a sound that governed everything, the bell. It rang from the parish church in the pale hours before sunrise, across damp fields and low roofs, over thorn hedges and cattle yards, through the thin walls of timber cottages, calling a village into motion. It marked prayer, it marked labour, it marked danger, it marked death. For those born under its voice, life was not imagined as an open road but as a circle, turning again and again through seed time, harvest, winter hunger, and the brief warm abundance of summer. To be born a medieval peasant was to inherit a place before inheriting a name. The land knew the family. The manor roll might record the father, the mother, the holding, the rent, the labour owed, the fines unpaid, the pig pastured in the woods, the strips cultivated in the open fields. A newborn child lay in straw, wrapped in rough cloth, warmed by breath and smoke, while outside the cottage waited a world already prepared to claim the body. There would be baptism quickly, often within days, for infant death was common, and the soul could not be left adrift. A godparent would stand near the font. Water would touch the child. A Christian name would be spoken. The village would receive another life into its memory. But birth was dangerous. The peasant household had no polished chamber, no trained physician standing by with silver instruments, no thick walls keeping out winter winds. Childbirth happened among women, in the warmest available corner, beneath the smell of smoke, sweat, herbs, damp wool, and fear. A mother might survive many births or die in one. A child might cry once and fade before morning. The parish cemetery held infants whose lives had lasted less than a season, and the smallness of their bones, recovered in archaeological excavation, reminds us that medieval poverty began at the first breath. Still, when a child lived, the household changed around it. A baby was not merely a mouth to feed, it was future labour, future security, future memory. Sons and daughters both mattered, though the law and custom often weighed them differently. A boy might one day plough, reap, repair hedges, manage animals, inherit land, or owe service to the Lord. A girl might brew, bake, spin, weed, milk, carry, nurse, marry, and become the centre of another household's survival. No child was useless for long. The medieval village had little room for childhood as a protected kingdom. Love existed, certainly, deep and fierce, but necessity shortened innocence. The first years were spent near the hearth. There, a child learned the world by watching, the mother bending over the pot, the father repairing a tool, an older sister carding wool, a grandmother telling saints' tales by the fire, a rooster calling from the yard, rain tapping through the thatch, fleas in the bedding, smoke in the eyes. The taste of coarse bread softened in broth, the fear of strangers, the comfort of familiar voices. The boundary of life was marked by what could be walked, touched, carried, fed, or feared. The village was a map of obligations. At its centre stood the church, where people were baptized, married, judged by sermons, and buried. Nearby might stand the manor house, larger than any cottage, its barns filled with grain, its dovecote, its fish pond, its court, its steward, its symbol of watchful authority. Around these clustered the homes of tenants, the crofts, the gardens, the pens, the workshops, the muddy lanes, the dung heaps, the wells, the bake ovens, the tracks leading outward into fields. Beyond lay strips of arable land, not usually gathered into neat private farms, but scattered across open fields in long, narrow portions. This strip system shaped the peasant mind. A family might hold land in fragments across several fields, each strip separated by ridges and furrows. The arrangement reduced risk. If one area flooded, another might survive, If one soil was poor, another might yield better grain. But it also bound neighbours together in timing and discipline. Ploughing, sowing, grazing, and harvest had to be coordinated. One person could not simply act alone without affecting others. The village was not a collection of isolated households. It was an organism of custom. Custom was law made from repetition. The lord possessed rights, but the peasants possessed memory. They knew what had always been owed, what had never been owed, which meadow opened after haymaking, which woodland could be entered, which path belonged to all, which widow had the right to stay in her cottage, which fine was excessive, which demand could be resisted because no grandfather had ever submitted to it. In a world where parchment belonged mostly to the powerful, communal memory became a kind of archive. A child absorbed this archive slowly. They learned not only how to weed barley or scare birds from grain, but whom to greet, whom to avoid, when to bow, when to speak, when silence was safer. They learned that the reeve, often a peasant himself, could be both neighbour and instrument of lordship. They learned that the mill was necessary and resented, since grain often had to be ground at the lord's mill for a fee. They learned that marriage was personal, but also economic. Land, animals, labour, reputation, and permission all mattered. They learned that poverty was not simply hunger, it was dependence measured in rules. Yet the manner was not identical everywhere. A peasant in England might live under different pressures than one in northern France, the German lands, Italy, Iberia, or the Slavic East. Some villages had more free tenants. Some had heavier labour services. Some landscapes favoured sheep, others rye, vines, olives, oats, or cattle. Some peasants lived near markets and could sell eggs, ale, cloth, or vegetables. Others remained far from towns, deep in forest clearings or upland valleys where survival depended on animals, fuel, and stubborn endurance. Medieval poverty had many faces, each shaped by soil, lordship, climate, war, and memory. The rhythm of the year ruled them all. Winter was not only cold, it was calculation. Grain stores had to be measured against mouths. Animals had to be kept alive or slaughtered. Firewood mattered. Roofs leaked. Illness travelled through crowded interiors. Spring brought hope and exhaustion together, for fields demanded labour when bodies were weakest. Summer meant weeding, hay, repairs, and watching the sky with anxious eyes. Harvest brought the great test, when every able hand, young and old, bent beneath the sun to cut, bind, carry, and store the crop on which the coming year depended. A peasant born beneath the manor bell did not ask whether work gave life meaning. Work was life's condition. From the beginning, the child was gathered into a chain older than memory. The dead lay in the churchyard. The living worked the fields. The unborn waited in the bodies of women. The Lord demanded. The priest warned. The seasons turned. And somewhere between fear and duty, hunger and laughter, obedience and quiet defiance, a human being learned what it meant to survive without ever imagining that history would one day wonder how it had been done. The peasant home was not a house in the way many would understand the word today. It was shelter, workshop, stable, storehouse, kitchen, bedroom, nursery, sick room, and refuge, all pressed into one dim enclosure of timber, mud, straw, smoke, and breath. From the outside, it might have seemed almost grown from the earth itself, a low building crouched against weather, its walls made of wattle and daub, its roof thatched with reeds, straw, heather, or whatever the landscape could provide. Its doorway was small, its windows were few. Glass was a luxury far beyond most households, so openings were covered with shutters, cloth, oiled skin, or simply left to the moods of wind and cold. Inside, darkness had weight. Even at midday, light entered reluctantly. It slipped through cracks, through the doorway, through smoke holes, through thin gaps in the wall, making pale shafts in the thick air. The hearth was the centre of the home, not merely because it cooked food, but because it kept death at a distance. Fire-dried clothes, warmed infants, hardened tools, boiled water, smoked meat, and gathered the family into its glow when the world outside turned black. A hearth going cold in winter was more than inconvenience, it was danger. There was rarely a chimney in the poorest cottages. Smoke rose from the fire and wandered beneath the roof, searching for escape through thatch and cracks. It stung the eyes, settled into hair and clothing, blackened beams, cured hanging meat, and filled lungs over years of breathing. The smell of smoke was the smell of home. It clung to skin, blankets, baskets, bowls, and memory. In winter, when doors and shutters stayed closed against cold, the air inside could become dense and bitter, but still preferable to the hard frost beyond the threshold. The floor was often beaten earth. In wet weather it grew damp. In dry weather it became dust. Rushes or straw might be scattered across it, gathering ash, crumbs, insects, mud, and the small refuse of daily life. Archaeological traces from deserted villages reveal packed surfaces, hearth stains, post holes, refuse pits, and the faint plans of vanished buildings where families once slept, argued, ate, laboured, and died. The grand halls of lords leave stone foundations. The homes of peasants leave shadows in soil. Furniture was sparse and precious. A table might be a board set upon trestles. Benches and stools were more common than chairs. Chests held clothing, tools, documents if the family possessed any, and goods too valuable to leave scattered. Wooden bowls, clay pots, iron hooks, baskets, knives, ladles, spindle whorls, and loom weights formed the ordinary equipment of existence. A bed, when present, was not always reserved for one or two people. It could hold parents, children, perhaps even a guest, crowded under blankets, cloaks, or rough coverings stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers in luckier homes. Privacy was nearly unknown. The modern idea of a room belonging to one person would have seemed strange in such a setting. People slept close. Bodies were familiar. Birth, sickness, nursing, dying, washing, dressing, and marital life unfolded within earshot of others. Shame existed, but space did not always permit it. The household was a shared organism. Its warmth came from proximity. Its tensions did too. Animals often lived near or inside the dwelling. A cow, goat, pig, or hens represented more than livestock. They were wealth on legs, fragile security wrapped in hide and feather. To keep an animal alive through winter could mean milk, manure, eggs, offspring, traction, meat, or sale. In some homes, a buyer occupied one end of the structure, separated from the family by a low partition or little more than habit. The smell of dung, damp straw, animal breath, wool, and smoke blended into one atmosphere. Fleas, lice, mites, and flies had no difficulty crossing the boundary between human and beast. Yet this closeness was practical. An animal housed near the hearth was warmer, safer from theft, and easier to tend at night. Its body heat helped the household. Its manure became fertilizer. Its presence was unpleasant. But poverty rarely allowed comfort to outrank survival. A family might complain of the smell while still knowing that the death of one cow could mean disaster. Medieval peasants did not live in filth, because they loved filth. They lived in crowded, dirty conditions because materials were scarce. Labour was endless, and every creature under the roof had a purpose. The cottage was also a place of production. Women spun wool or flax whenever hands were free. Children helped card fibres, gather kindling, carry water, sort beans, watch animals, or stir the pot. Men repaired harness, sharpened blades, carved handles, patched walls, and mended tools. Brewing might be done at home. Baking might happen in a shared oven, but dough was prepared indoors. Herbs dried from rafters, onions, garlic, roots, and grains were stored against hunger. Nothing sat idle for long. Every corner held work. The walls themselves demanded care. Daub cracked, thatch rotted, posts decayed. Rain found weaknesses. Wind pried at edges. Rodents entered stores. Fire threatened everything. A spark in dry thatch could consume not only one cottage, but a line of homes packed close along a lane. Repairs were constant. A household that neglected its roof invited sickness, spoilage, and shame. Maintenance was not a separate task performed when convenient. It was part of living, woven into the days between field labour and exhaustion. Around the cottage lay the croft. This small enclosure attached to the dwelling could be one of the most important spaces in peasant life. Here grew cabbages, leeks, onions, beans, peas, herbs, and perhaps fruit trees. Here hens scratched, here pigs rooted, here children played among useful things. A garden was not decoration. It was nutrition, medicine, flavour, and insurance. When grain failed or rents emptied the store, the garden might keep a family alive a little longer. Its produce rarely appears in grand accounts, but in the economy of survival it mattered immensely. Water had to be carried. A well-like stream, spring, or pond might serve the village. Each trip took time and strength. Water was needed for cooking, brewing, washing, animals, and small industries of the home. Cleanliness did exist, though it was limited by labour, cold, access, and belief. People washed faces, hands, linens when possible, and tools when needed. They valued fresh water and feared foul smells, even without modern germ theory. But the closeness of animals, waste, mud, and limited drainage made disease a constant companion. At night the cottage changed character. The fields disappeared. The lanes grew silent except for dogs, owls, wind, and the restless sounds of animals. Inside, firelight moved across faces and beams. Stories emerged in the half-dark. Saints, ghosts, thieves, wolves, wandering strangers, old battles, family scandals, and warnings passed from mouth to mouth. Children learned fear and belonging from these voices. The home was cramped, smoky, poor, and vulnerable, but it was also the place where memory survived. For all its hardship, the cottage was not merely a symbol of misery. It was the peasant's fortress against a dangerous world. Its door could be barred, its hearth could glow, its roof, however leaky, stood between flesh and storm. Within it, marriages were negotiated, children were named, wounds were bound, tools were made ready, debts were worried over, and prayers were whispered into smoke. The great medieval world of throne, altar, and sword depended on places like this, small homes in the mud, where the poor gathered themselves each morning and somehow continued. Bread was the measure of life, not gold, not glory, not the bright metal of swords carried by men on horseback. For the poor of the medieval countryside, survival could be counted in loaves, in handfuls of grain, in the depth of a bin, in the weight of a sack lifted from the floor and judged by the body before the mind had time to calculate. Bread sat at the centre of the peasant table, and when bread grew scarce, the whole world seemed to narrow around the stomach. But this was not the white bread of nobles, soft and pale, sifted and fine. Peasant bread was dark, coarse, heavy, and honest. It was made from rye, barley, oats, maslin, or whatever mixture of grains the land had yielded and the Lord had not claimed. Wheat was prized, but not always available to the poor, especially in colder or wetter regions where hardier grains gave more reliable returns. The flour was ground on millstones that left tiny particles of grit behind, so that a lifetime of eating bread slowly wore down teeth like tools used against stone. The loaf itself was a world of labour. First came the ploughing, the sowing, the weeding, the harvesting, the threshing, the winnowing, the carrying, the storing, the grinding, the kneading, the baking. A piece of bread was not simply food. It was a year made edible. It was rain captured in grain. It was muscle translated into sustenance. It was the sun, the soil, the ox, the sickle, the flail, the aching back, the rent paid, the tithe removed, and the small remainder left to the family. No one ate carelessly. A peasant household understood scarcity in the hand. Bread could be cut thick when stores were full, thin when the year turned anxious. Crusts were saved. Stale bread was softened in broth. Crumbs were gathered. Mould could be scraped away if the hunger demanded it. Nothing that could be chewed was easily abandoned. The rich might speak of feasts as displays of honour. The poor knew food as a negotiation with time. Beside the bread stood the pot. Pottage was the true companion of the medieval poor, simmering in some form across countless hearths. Into it went peas, beans, leeks, onions, cabbage, nettles, herbs, oats, scraps of bacon when fortune allowed, bones for flavour, cheese rind, and whatever the garden and field edge or woodland had offered. It might be thick enough to hold a spoon upright in better days, or thin as brown water in lean ones. It could be nourishing, dull, bitter, fragrant, or desperate. The pot changed with the seasons, and the seasons decided more than taste. In spring there might be green things, young nettles, wild leaves, herbs, shoots, and early garden growth could bring life to bodies tired from winter. In summer came beans, peas, onions, and greens. In autumn came grains, nuts, apples, roots, and slaughtered animals that could not be fed through the cold months. Winter brought salted meat if there was any, dried peas, stored grain, hard cheese, and prayers that the supplies would last. The diet of poverty was not always starvation. At times it could be varied, earthy, and sufficient, but its security was fragile. Meat existed, but not as a daily certainty. A pig was the most useful animal for many poor households, able to root in woodland and turn scraps into flesh. Pork could be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh at slaughter time. Chickens gave eggs, though eggs might be sold rather than eaten when coin was needed. A cow gave milk if the household was fortunate enough to keep one. Sheep gave wool before they gave meat. Game animals in the Lord's forest were often forbidden, making the deer seen between trees both temptation and danger. Fish mattered where water allowed. Rivers, ponds, streams, and coastal shallows could feed the poor. Though rights were often controlled, eels were especially valuable in some regions. Slippery wealth from the water, eaten fresh, salted, or paid as rent. On church, fast days, when meat was forbidden, fish gained importance. Though for poor families religious discipline often blended with practical limitation. Abstinence was easier when meat was already rare. Drink was also survival. Water could be good, but it could also be suspect, especially near settlements, animals, and waste. Ale was common, low in strength by later standards, nourishing, safer when properly brewed, and consumed by adults and children alike. Brewing was often household work, frequently done by women, and it offered both sustenance and potential income. A mug of ale was not merely pleasure, it was grain in liquid form, calories poured into the body, warmth against cold, courage against weariness. Dairy added another layer to survival. Milk, buttermilk, curds, and cheese provided protein and fat, though not every household had reliable access. Cheese could be stored, traded, carried to fields, or eaten with bread. Butter was valuable. Whey might not be wasted. Nothing in the milk pail belonged to luxury alone. Each product represented careful household management, especially by women who turned unstable milk into food that could last. Salt was precious. Without it, meat spoiled, cheese suffered, and preservation became harder. Salted fish, salted pork, salted butter, and pickled vegetables helped bridge the dangerous distance between abundance and hunger. Spices were largely for the wealthy, though local herbs carried flavour and medicinal meaning. Garlic, mustard, parsley, sage, fennel, and other plants could lift a dull meal into something remembered. Even poverty had taste. Even hunger knew the difference between bland survival and a bowl that carried warmth, sharpness, and comfort. Then came the famine years. The sky could betray everything. Too much rain rotted grain. Drought shriveled it. Late frost killed blossoms. Storms flattened fields just before harvest. War trampled crops. Disease killed animals. A bad harvest didn't strike only the stomach. It entered the mind. It changed how people looked at one another. It turned generosity into calculation. It made parents count children's portions with silent terror. When grain stores failed, people turned to what remained. They stretched flour with peas, beans, acorns, vetch, bran, roots, bark, and ground seeds. They ate animals meant for breeding. They gathered wild plants with less care for taste than for survival. Some foods caused sickness. Some fill the belly without feeding the body. The line between food and desperation blurred. The body became weaker, more open to fever, less able to work, and thus less able to secure more food. Hunger was not an event. It was a spiral. The poor did not understand nutrition in modern language, yet they understood strength. They knew which meals carried a worker through a day. They knew the heaviness of good bread, the comfort of fat, the value of beans, the blessing of cheese, the sorrow of a pot with too much water and too little substance. They knew that children with full bellies slept differently. They knew that old people might pretend not to be hungry. They knew that the last loaf had a sound when cut, and that sound could fill a room with dread. Food also bound the community. Harvest meals, weddings, church feasts, ale gatherings, and small acts of sharing mattered because scarcity made them meaningful. To offer bread was to offer life. To refuse it might be remembered. A neighbour with a cow, an oven, a garden, a strong sun, or a hidden store of grain held power. Charity was praised by the church, but charity also had eyes. It could build honour, settle obligation, or mark dependence. In the medieval peasant world, poverty was tasted every day. It was in the grit between the teeth, the thin broth, the guarded grain bin, the smell of cabbage from the pot, the joy of bacon fat, the sweetness of an apple, the ache of fasting not chosen freely, and the relief when harvest finally brought the first real fullness after months of fear. Bread, pottage, ale, cheese, beans, and roots were not humble details beneath history. They were history itself, taken into the body, chewed, swallowed, and turned into one more day alive. Work began before the sun had fully declared itself. A grey line would gather beyond the fields, touching the roofs, the church tower, the bare trees, the ridges of ploughed earth, and already the village was stirring. Doors opened, cocks called, dogs barked, feet found wooden clogs or leather shoes stiff with old mud. Someone coughed in the cold air. Someone carried water. Someone fed animals. Someone pulled a cloak tighter and looked toward the sky, searching for signs of mercy or trouble. For the medieval peasant, dawn was not poetic, dawn was instruction. The body rose because the world required it, hunger required it, rent required it, animals required it, soil required it, children required it, the Lord required it, God required it. There was no clean division between work and life, no hour at which labour ended and existence began. To live was to maintain, to repair, to tend, to carry, to cut, to dig, to bind, to lift, to turn, to haul, to watch, to endure. The agricultural year was a wheel, and every season placed its own weight upon the shoulders. In winter, when fields lay quiet under frost or rain, the work did not vanish. It changed shape. Tools had to be repaired. Harness had to be mended. Hedges had to be laid and strengthened. For boundaries were not merely lines on land, but living defences against wandering livestock. Ditches needed clearing so water would not ruin fields. Firewood had to be gathered, chopped, stacked, guarded, and rationed. Animals kept indoors demanded feed, bedding, cleaning, and attention. Grain had to be threshed with flails, stroke after stroke, separating seed from stalk in barns thick with dust. Threshing was hard, monotonous, necessary work. The flail rose and fell. Grain heads cracked, chaff flew, shoulders burned, hands blistered. Breath turned white in the cold. The sound carried from barn to lane, a dull rhythm of survival. Then came winnowing, when grain was tossed so the lighter chaff could be taken by air while the heavier kernels fell. A poor winnowing meant waste. Waste meant danger. Every kernel mattered. Spring brought urgency. The soil had to be opened. The plough, often drawn by oxen, cut through heavy earth with slow violence. Oxen were patient and strong, but they required care, food, and command. A plough team might be shared among neighbours, since few households possessed everything needed alone. Men guided the blade, boys drove animals, women followed with seed, or weeded, or carried, or worked gardens and dairies while field tasks multiplied around them. The earth smelled wet and alive, but spring was also a cruel season. For bodies weakened by winter now had to labour with renewed force. Sowing required judgment. Too much seed wasted the household's future. Too little risked hunger. Each sower walked the field with a bag or basket, casting grain by hand in practiced arcs. The movement looked simple only to those who had never done it. Each throw carried hope. Each patch of soil received a portion of the family's stored life. Birds watched from hedges. Children might be sent to shout, clap, and throw stones, guarding the seed from hungry beaks. Then came weeding. It was dull, stooping work, but neglect invited ruin. Weeds stole strength from grain and vegetables. Women and children often laboured at this task, fingers working through damp soil, backs bent beneath a wide sky. The pain of such work rarely entered chronicles. No monk paused to record the ache in a girl's spine after hours among beans, yet the harvest depended on it. History often remembers battles, but survival belonged to those who removed weeds from barley. Summer was no rest. Haymaking arrived with the heat, and hay was life for animals through winter. It had to be cut, dried, turned, gathered, and stored before rain spoiled it. The work depended on weather, and weather answered no human command. A field of cut hay beneath approaching clouds could fill a village with panic. Everyone able to work might be called into the meadow. Scythes swept through grass, rakes scratched the ground, arms lifted bundles, sweat ran into eyes, insects rose in clouds. The smell of drying hay was sweet, but the labour behind it was relentless. Harvest was the great trial. All year bent toward it, the village entered a state of heightened purpose, almost fever. Grain could not stand forever in the field. Once ripe, it had to be cut before storm, rot, theft or animals destroyed it, men and women worked with sickles, bending low, cutting stalks by hand, gathering sheaves, binding them, stacking them, hauling them. Children gleaned fallen ears. Old people sorted, watched, carried what they could. The pace was punishing because delay could mean starvation. Harvest also brought a strange kind of joy. There was exhaustion, yes, but also the sight of abundance made visible. Golden sheaves standing in stooks across the fields, carts groaning beneath grain, laughter breaking out from tired workers, ale passed from hand to hand, songs rising over the stubble. For a moment, the village could see its own survival taking shape. Even then, the crop was not truly theirs. Portions would go to lord, church, seed, rent, debt, and animals. Yet before all those claims emptied the pile, there was the human relief of having something to gather. Autumn was the season of preparation. Fields were ploughed again for winter crops where the system allowed. Animals were assessed, which could be fed through winter, which must be slaughtered. Pigs fattened on woodland mast, acorns and beech nuts that could turn forest into meat. Vegetables and roots were stored. Buildings were patched before storms. Wood was gathered more urgently. The year folded inward, and every household judged its chances. Labour was not only agricultural. Peasants built and repaired roads, bridges, fences, barns, cottages, carts, gates and tools. They dug marl or clay, they collected reeds for thatch, they carried stones. They helped maintain mills and ovens. They brewed ale, spun thread, wove cloth, made baskets, cut turf, gathered nuts, tended bees in some places, cared for geese, washed linen, salted meat, churned butter, and sold small goods at market when possible. Poverty created no idleness. It created too many tasks and too little time. The body paid the price. Hands thickened, nails broke, skin split in winter, feet suffered from damp, cold, and rough footwear. Backs bent under loads, knees failed, shoulders stiffened. Accidents could change everything. A cut from a blade, a kick from an ox, a fall from a cart, an infected blister, a crushed hand. Each could threaten a household's survival. There was little margin for injury in a world where food came through labour. Time itself was experienced differently. The day was shaped by light, bells, meals, animals, and tasks rather than clocks. Summer days stretched long, demanding work from dawn deep into evening. Winter shortened outdoor labour, but intensified indoor work and hunger. Sundays and holy days offered some relief, though animals still needed care and food still needed preparation. Feast days could interrupt toil, not merely as religious observance, but as necessary human breathing space. Yet work was not always solitary suffering. Much labour was communal. Plough teams required coordination. Harvest gathered many bodies into one effort. Women worked together at washing, brewing, spinning, childbirth, and food preparation. Men cooperated in repairs, carting, cutting, and field systems. Shared labour created conversation, courtship, rivalry, jokes, songs, grudges, and reputation. The village watched how each person worked. Laziness could be condemned, skill could be admired, strength mattered, reliability mattered more. A peasant's labour was never abstract. Every task touched survival directly. A sharpened blade meant easier cutting. A repaired roof meant dry bedding. A cleared ditch meant less flooding. A weeded field meant more grain. A stored stack of hay meant living cattle. A mended shoe meant fewer wounds. Work was the language through which people negotiated with hunger, weather, obligation, and death. When darkness finally settled, labour still lingered in the bones. The peasant returned from field, yard, barn, woodland, or meadow not as a figure of picturesque simplicity, but as someone spent by necessity. The hands smelled of soil, animal, smoke, iron, sweat, or grain dust. The back ached, the stomach waited. Tomorrow had already formed itself in the mind. Another ditch, another strip, another animal, another journey for water, another payment due, another sky to read. This was survival measured not in heroic moments, but in repetition. Again and again. The poor rose into the cold, entered the mud, bent to the earth, and gave their strength to a world that rarely thanked them. Their labour did not decorate medieval civilization, it carried it. Every castle feast, every monastery prayer, every market day, every armed expedition, every cathedral stone lifted toward heaven, rested upon fields where ordinary people worked until daylight failed. Poverty was not only what remained after a poor harvest, it was also what was taken. In the medieval village, the peasant household stood beneath many hands, each reaching for a portion of its labour. The lord claimed rights over land, the church claimed the tithe, the king or prince might demand tax, the manor court imposed fines, the mill took its fee, the oven took its fee, the brewer, the reeve, the bailiff, the priest, the collector, the messenger from distant authority. All could appear at the edge of ordinary life and turn survival into accounting. A family might look at its grain after harvest and know, even before the first loaf was baked, that much of it was already promised away. Rent came in different forms, some paid in coin if the household could earn or save enough through market sales, wage labour or craft work. Others paid in kind, with grain, eggs, hens, cheese, honey, ale, or animals. Some owed labour services, days spent on the lord's domain, the land reserved for his own profit. These duties could fall at terrible moments, when a family's own fields also demanded attention. To work the lord's land during harvest weather was to watch one's own crops stand vulnerable beneath the same sky. This was one of the quiet cruelties of the system. The demand did not always arrive when convenient. It arrived when custom allowed, when the lord's steward ordered, when the manor required. A peasant might need to plough his own strip, repair his roof, cut his hay, or bring in barley before rain, yet still be summoned elsewhere. The loss was not only time, it was risk. A day removed from one field could become a week of shortage months later. The tithe carried another kind of weight. In theory, 1/10 of produce belonged to the church, supporting priest, parish, poor relief, buildings, lights, and sacred life. In practice, the tithe could feel like another hunger placed upon the household. Grain, lambs, wool, fruit, and other produce might be measured and removed. For devout peasants, the tithe existed inside a world of belief, duty, fear, and hope. To cheat God was dangerous. Yet to surrender food while children watched the store shrink was also hard. Faith did not erase arithmetic. Then there were fees attached to ordinary necessity. Grain often had to be ground at the lord's mill. The miller kept a portion, and millers were widely suspected of taking more than their due. Bread might have to be baked in the lord's oven, again for a charge. Ale could be regulated, tested, fined, or taxed. A peasant could be punished for selling poor ale, short measures, or bread under standard weight. Yet the poorest households were precisely those tempted to stretch ingredients. Regulation and survival stood in uneasy tension. Even life's milestones could cost money. When a father died, the heir might owe a payment to take up the holding. When a daughter married, permission or fines could be involved, especially among unfree tenants. A widow might have to negotiate her right to remain. A man wishing to leave the manor could face payment or prohibition. A family transferring land, settling disputes, or entering agreements might encounter fees that turned private grief into public obligation. The manor court recorded much of this world. It was not only a place of punishment, it was also the administrative heart of local custom. There, tenants were named, fined, corrected, accused, excused, and remembered a broken fence, stray animals, brewing violations, unpaid dues, unauthorized marriages, inheritance claims, assaults, thefts, bad ploughing, blocked paths, neglected ditches, all could appear before the assembled community. The language of the court was formal, but beneath it lay daily life in all its friction. The fines were often small to modern eyes, a few pence, a hen, a measure of grain. But small sums mattered deeply in a cash-poor world. Coin did not flow easily through every household. To pay even a modest fine might require selling eggs, working for wages, borrowing from a neighbour, delaying another payment, or eating less. The economy of poverty was delicate. Tiny official demand could disturb the whole structure. Debt was another hidden chain. Seed might be borrowed, grain might be loaned, tools might be shared with expectation of return. A poor household might owe money to a better-off villager, a priest, a merchant, a lord's officer, or kin. Debt did not always mean ruin. It could be part of normal village life, a way of surviving uneven seasons. But it could also expose weakness. The creditor knew who had failed. The village knew who had begged. Reputation became currency, and shame became collateral. Some peasants had more room to maneuver than others. A prosperous tenant with animals, adult children, good land, and market access might manage dues without immediate danger. A widow with small children, a land-poor labourer, a sick man, or a household struck by animal disease had far less protection. Medieval poverty was unequal even among peasants. The village contained gradations of hardship from those who owned teams and hired others to those who survived by day labour, gleaning, spinning, and favours. Coin entered peasant life through markets, wages, and small sales. A woman might sell ale, eggs, butter, cheese, cloth, or poultry. A man might hire himself out for harvest work, ditching, carting, thatching, or construction. Children might serve in other households. Pigs, lambs, wool, hides, surplus grain, and garden produce could be turned into money when fortune allowed. But selling food could be painful. A household might carry eggs to market while its own children wanted them. Poverty often meant converting nourishment into rent. Taxes from higher powers added another layer of dread. Royal wars, crusading demands, emergency levies, and local assessments could descend upon villages already stretched by lordship and tithe. To those far from courts and battlefields, the ambitions of kings were felt as missing grain, lost coin, and new pressure from collectors. A war might be spoken of in noble terms, but the poor encountered it through requisition, taxation, marching men, damaged crops, and animals taken for transport. Extraction did not always require violence. Much of it operated through custom, record, ritual, and fear. The peasant brought the rent. The tithe was measured. The fine was declared. The labour day was performed. Authority became ordinary by being repeated. Yet beneath obedience lived calculation. Could a payment be delayed? Could a hen be smaller? Could grain be hidden? Could labour be slow? Could a boundary be argued? Could an old custom be remembered loudly enough to restrain a new demand? Resistance often wore humble clothing. A peasant might fail to appear. A field might be poorly worked. Wood might be taken at night. Animals might graze where they should not. Grain might be withheld. A court order might be obeyed halfway. No trumpet sounded. No banner rose. But in these small evasions, People defended fragments of life from a system that consumed them by inches. Poverty then was not passive emptiness. It was a contest over portions. Who owned the crop? Who owned the day? Who owned the daughter's marriage, the son's inheritance, the cow's pasture, the loaf in the oven, the ale in the jug, the wood on the hearth? The medieval peasant lived among these questions constantly, not as philosophy, but as pressure in the stomach. When the payments were made and the officials gone, what remained had to be stretched across the year. That remainder was the real territory of survival. It sat in bins, hung in rafters, stood in animals, grew in gardens, rested in favours owed by neighbours, and lived in the skill of those who could make little endure. The poor did not simply suffer poverty. They managed it, measured it, hid from it, negotiated with it, and sometimes rose against it. But every rent day reminded them of the same hard truth. The field might be worked by peasant hands, watered by peasant sweat, watched by peasant children, and feared by peasant mothers, yet the harvest never belonged to them alone. In the medieval village, survival often rested in the hands of women, not softly, not symbolically, not as some gentle presence beside the great machinery of peasant life. It rested there literally, in fingers cracked by lye and cold water, in palms hardened by querns and buckets, in backs bent beneath bundles of fuel, in arms that held infants while stirring pots, lifting pails, carrying grain, kneading dough, spinning thread, and keeping a household from falling apart. The peasant woman did not live in the margins of labour. She stood at its centre. Her work began early and multiplied before anyone had counted it. Fire had to be revived from embers or struck anew. Water had to be fetched. The pot had to be tended. Children had to be fed, cleaned as well as conditions allowed, watched, corrected, carried, or sent to small tasks. Animals near the home had to be milked, released, fed, gathered, or guarded. Hens needed tension. Pigs had to be managed. Dairy work could not be postponed simply because a field demanded help. Milk soured. Butter failed. Cheese spoiled. Hunger did not respect exhaustion. Much of women's labour vanished because it left no monument. A ploughed field could be counted. A rent payment could be recorded. A court fine could be written down. But how does a record measure the daily saving of scraps, the careful stretching of flour, the judgment of when ale has turned, the hand that knows by smell whether milk will set, the memory of which child coughed through the night, the ability to cut cloth so nothing is wasted, the skill to make one poor garment serve 3 growing bodies? These were not decorative talents. They were technologies of survival. Brewing was one of the great household arts. Ale was food, comfort, trade, and social bond. Women often brewed for their families and sometimes for sale, becoming known in their communities as alewives. Brewing required grain, water, heat, vessels, timing, cleanliness of a kind suited to the task, and practical experience passed through observation. Too weak, and it disappointed. Too sour, and it might be condemned. Too little, and the household lacked nourishment. Good ale could bring coin, reputation, and gossip to the doorway. Bad ale could bring fines, mockery, and loss. Baking was no less important. Dough was a living thing, watched and handled. Flour, water, leavening, salt when available, and heat had to be judged by touch more than written instruction. The Lord's oven, a shared oven, or a household hearth might all shape the final loaf. Bread could fail, it could burn, crack, sour, collapse, or emerge too small for the need placed upon it. When grain was precious, failure was not merely frustrating, it was costly. Spinning followed women through life like a second pulse. A distaff might be held while walking, watching animals, talking with neighbours, or waiting. Wool and flax had to be cleaned, prepared, spun, wound, woven, sewn, patched, and repatched. Cloth was expensive because it consumed time. Every thread was labour made visible. A woman who could spin well contributed not only clothing but economic value. Garments kept bodies alive through winter, protected skin during work, signalled status, and could be pawned, gifted, inherited, or fought over. Childbearing carried danger beyond measure. Pregnancy did not remove a woman from labour. She still worked, lifted, walked, cooked, tended, and worried. Birth approached with fear and expectation, surrounded by other women, prayers, charms, saints, herbs, experience, and uncertainty. A successful birth brought relief, but also a new demand upon the body. Nursing consumed strength. Infants required constant attention. A mother weakened by hunger might struggle to feed a child. A mother who died left not only grief, but a household crisis. Women also carried knowledge of healing, not formal medicine in the learned language of universities, but household medicine, field medicine, memory medicine, which leaves cooled swelling, which roots purged, which poultice drew infection, which prayer accompanied fever, which neighbour had skill with childbirth, which old woman understood bones, burns, milk troubles, rashes, coughs, and bleeding. Some remedies helped, some did not. But in villages far from physicians, this knowledge mattered. The law placed women beneath men, yet life was more complicated than law. A married woman's legal identity could be constrained by her husband's authority. Property, inheritance, marriage permission, and sexual reputation were all watched closely. Yet women appeared in manor courts, made complaints, paid fines, brewed for sale, held land as widows, managed households, hired labour, and defended rights. Widowhood could be harsh, especially with children, but it could also create a narrow space of authority. A widow who retained land, animals, tools, and allies might become a formidable figure in village life. Marriage was practical as well as emotional. A peasant marriage joined labour forces, land claims, kinship networks, obligations, tools, animals, and future children. Affection could grow, and desire certainly existed, but survival shaped choice. A strong worker, a good brewer, a competent ploughman, a woman with dairy skill, a man with access to land, a family with animals, these mattered. Marriage was private in feeling, public in consequence. The village watched who married whom because every household was part of a larger web. Women's reputations were guarded and attacked with intensity. Gossip had teeth. A woman accused of sexual misconduct, scolding, dishonest brewing, theft, poor housekeeping, or quarrelsome behaviour could suffer socially and legally. Yet gossip could also be a weapon used by women against men and against one another. In small communities, and speech was power. The tongue could punish where the court had not yet moved. A woman's honour affected her marriage prospects, market dealings, neighbourly support, and standing in times of need. Peasant women laboured in the fields as well. Images of medieval agriculture often show men at the plough, but women weeded, harvested, gleaned, spread manure, gathered hay, carried sheaves, tended gardens, watched animals, and performed seasonal field labour when required. During harvest, no capable body could be ignored. A woman might cut grain with one hand while keeping a child near the field edge. She might return from field work to cook, clean, nurse, spin, and prepare for the next day. Carrying two worlds of labour where one would have exhausted many, gleaning was especially important. After the main harvest, poor women and children might gather fallen ears of grain from the stubble. Each handful looked small. Together, they could become bread, porridge, or seed. Gleaning required patience and sharp eyes, a humility imposed by poverty, but also a right defended by custom in many places. To bend over a harvested field searching for what others had missed was to live in the narrow space between charity, entitlement, and hunger. Women also preserved the social fabric. They attended births, washed bodies for burial, arranged food for feasts, exchanged favours, carried news, mediated disputes, and sustained kinship. They knew who was sick, who was pregnant, who had no grain left, who was drinking too much, who was being beaten, who had quarrelled with a lord's officer, who needed help and who could not be trusted. In a world without written notices for most villagers, women's conversations carried intelligence essential to survival. None of this made their lives easy or equal. A woman could face violence inside marriage, danger in childbirth, legal disadvantage, economic dependence, social control, and relentless work. But to imagine her only as oppressed is to miss her strength. She was constrained. Yes. Watched. Yes. Burdened. Yes. Yet she also created food, cloth, drink, children, memory, trade, medicine, and continuity. The household survived because she knew how to turn fragments into life. At dusk, when the village darkened and smoke rose from low roofs, women's work still continued. The pot needed stirring. The infant woke. Wool waited. A shirt needed patching. A husband's tools had to be found. A daughter had to be taught. A son had to be scolded. The fire had to be banked so morning would not begin with cold ash. Beyond the doorway lay lordship, rent, weather, hunger, and sickness. Within the walls, a woman measured what remained and decided how to make it last. The medieval peasant world was held together not only by ploughs, courts, bells, and fields, but by the countless unrecorded acts of women whose names disappeared, while their labour entered every loaf, every garment, every child, every cup of ale, and every family that endured one more winter. Children in the medieval village grew close to the ground. They knew mud before letters, smoke before scripture, hunger before doctrine, and the moods of animals before the names of distant kings. Their world was built from touch and sound, the roughness of wool against skin, the sting of cold water on hands, the warmth of a sleeping dog, the slap of bare feet on packed earth, the call of adults from the yard, the warning cry when an ox shifted its weight or a pig broke loose. Childhood was real, but it was brief. A small child might be cherished, kissed, carried, soothed, and mourned with terrible intensity if death came. Yet the same child would soon be folded into the work of the household. There was no long protected season in which play stood apart from usefulness. A boy or girl learned by following, watching, imitating, and being corrected. The village did not run on written manuals. It ran on memory entering the body through repetition. The first lessons were simple. Do not go near the well alone. Do not frighten the cow. Do not waste bread. Do not step on the seedlings. Do not leave the gate open. Do not touch the blade. Do not wander into the wood when the light is failing. Do not speak rudely to the reeve. Do not mock the priest. Do not take what can be seen. Do not admit what cannot be proven. These lessons were survival disguised as obedience. A child might be sent to gather sticks, mind geese, chase birds from fields, collect eggs, carry water in small vessels, sort beans, scare crows, turn a spit, watch younger siblings, or follow animals to pasture. None of these tasks looked grand. Yet each one taught the child how the village functioned. A goose lost a fox or theft mattered. A pot left untended mattered. A little spilled grain mattered. Poverty trained attention early. Play existed in the cracks. Children made toys from what the world gave them. Sticks became swords. ploughs, horses, saints, monsters, and tools. Pebbles became counters, nuts, bones, scraps of cloth, carved bits of wood, hoops, balls, and clay figures could become entire kingdoms. They ran in lanes, climbed banks, splashed in puddles, dared one another near forbidden places, sang fragments of adult songs, repeated jokes they did not yet understand, and turned workspaces into worlds of imagination. But play could be dangerous. A pond was not only a pond, it was drowning. A fire was not only warmth, it was burning. A cart was not only transport, it was crushing weight. Animals could kick, bite, trample, gore, or roll. A fall from a tree could become a lifelong limp. Infection waited in small wounds. A child's curiosity met a world full of sharp edges, cold water, open flames, unstable structures, and diseases no one could see. Illness shaped childhood with a heavy hand. Fevers passed through cottages. Coughs settled in chests. Skin eruptions spread among siblings. Parasites lived in hair, bedding, bellies, and clothing. Malnutrition made bodies less able to withstand sickness. Archaeological study of medieval skeletons often reveals stress in early life, visible in teeth and bones, where hunger or disease interrupted growth and left marks long after the pain itself was forgotten. The body kept its own record, even when no scribe knew the child's name. Many children did not reach adulthood. This fact hung over families without making love impossible. Parents knew loss, but knowledge did not harden the heart into stone. A mother who had buried one infant still feared for the next. A father who seemed stern in the field might sit awake beside a fevered child. Grief existed in a world that demanded work the following morning. The dead were carried to consecrated ground, prayed over, remembered in names given again, and absorbed into the village's quiet history. For those who survived, growing older meant becoming useful in more serious ways. Girls learned food preparation, spinning, dairying, brewing, care of younger children, poultry keeping, garden work, washing, sewing, and the social intelligence required to move safely through village life. Boys learned animal handling, tool repair, ploughing, carting, ditching, cutting, hauling, and the customs of land. These divisions were real, but necessity crossed them often. A hungry field did not refuse a girl's hands. A household without daughters still needed cooking and care. Work bent categories when survival required it. Some children entered service. To leave the family home and work in another household was not always abandonment or cruelty. It could be training, discipline, necessity, or opportunity. A servant child or adolescent might receive food, lodging, perhaps wages, perhaps future connections. Service taught obedience, skill, and the ways of households richer or more stable than one's own. It could also expose the young to harshness, exploitation, loneliness, and homesickness. A child sent away carried the village within them, but slept under another roof. Apprenticeship opened different paths, especially in towns, though not all peasant children could reach them. A boy might be bound to learn a craft, living under a master's authority for years. A girl might enter domestic service, textile work, brewing, trade, or other forms of labour depending on region and circumstance. These movements connected village to town, field to workshop, poverty to possibility. Yet even possibility had a price. Fees, contacts, permission, and family strategy all mattered. Children also learned fear of authority. The Lord was not always seen in person, but his power was present in fields as rents, woods, courts, mills, and rules. The priest was visible, speaking of sin, saints, heaven, hell, confession, and proper conduct. Older villagers enforced norms with scolding, blows, jokes, warnings, and stories. A child learned that every action had witnesses in a small community. Secrecy was difficult, and reputation began early. Punishment was common. Children were beaten at times by parents, masters, employers, or teachers where schooling existed. Medieval people often believed correction entered through the body, but discipline was not the whole of family life. There were lullabies, festival treats, small gifts, shared laughter, whispered stories, and the warmth of belonging. Even in poverty, a child might remember the taste of fresh curds, the thrill of a fair, the brightness of candles on a holy day, or the joy of running after harvest carts in the stubble. The church marked the imagination. Children saw painted saints, crucifixes, candles, graves, processions, vestments, holy water, and the drama of the liturgical year. They learned prayers by sound before meaning. They watched adults kneel, confess, fast, feast, and fear judgment. Sacred stories mingled with village tales until angels, demons, ancestors, witches, saints, and wandering souls filled the unseen edges of the world. The supernatural was not entertainment. It was part of the landscape. Food taught hierarchy. A child noticed who ate first, who took the largest portion, who saved morsels, who went without. They learned not to ask when the pot was thin. They learned the emotional weather of scarcity. A mother's silence near the grain bin, a father's anger after a failed bargain, a grandmother giving away her share and claiming she was not hungry. Poverty educated the young through gestures no sermon needed to explain. By adolescence, the child was no longer truly a child. The body strengthened, and with strength came expectation. Marriage, service, labour, inheritance, wages, and reputation approached. A young person might begin to test boundaries, flirt at festivals, quarrel in lanes, boast in fields, resent commands, dream of leaving, or fear never being able to. Youth carried energy into a world that valued labour but distrusted disorder. The village needed the young, watched them, judged them, and slowly made them into adults. The hidden world of peasant children was not a place of innocence untouched by hardship. It was a training ground for endurance. They learned how to read clouds, animals, faces, tools, hunger, and danger. They learned that laughter could live beside grief. They learned that every object had value, every adult had a place, every path had a story, and every season asked something different from the body. From mud, memory, fear, play, work, prayer, illness, and instruction. The medieval child was shaped into a survivor, not because childhood was easy, because it had to be survived first. Faith entered the village through sound, colour, fear, and hope. It rang from the bell tower over frozen fields. It flickered in candles before painted saints. It whispered in charms spoken beside sick beds. It rose in chants from the priest's mouth. In Latin many villagers could not fully understand, yet still felt in the bones. It waited in the churchyard, where the dead lay close to the living, wrapped in earth, memory, and expectation. For medieval peasants, religion was not a separate part of life. It was the shape of life itself. The parish church stood at the centre of the visible world, even when small, poor, damp, and roughly built. It carried a power no cottage possessed. Its walls held images of heaven, hell, judgment, mercy, martyrdom, sin, and salvation. A peasant who could not read a manuscript could still read a wall painting. Flames around the damned, angels lifting souls, saints pierced by arrows or holding their instruments of suffering, Christ wounded, enthroned, watching. The building taught through sight as much as sermon. The church calendar gave order to time. There were fast days and feast days, vigils and holy seasons, saints' days and processions, days of abstinence, days of celebration, days when work slowed or stopped if custom allowed. The year was not merely spring, summer, autumn, and winter. It was Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, harvest blessings, rogation processions through the fields, and the long chain of sacred observances that placed the village inside a story larger than hunger. This mattered. A peasant might own little, travel rarely, and die within sight of the place of birth. Yet faith placed that small life inside a cosmic drama. The poorest woman kneeling on cold stone was not, in that moment, only a tenant, wife, widow, servant, or labourer. She was a soul. The bent old man with ruined teeth and swollen joints was not merely spent labour. He was a soul. The child coughing beside the hearth, the thief fined in court, the shepherd sleeping under rain, the brewer accused of bad ale, all moved beneath the same unseen judgment. Heaven gave meaning to endurance. Hell gave terror to error. Purgatory filled the space between, a place of cleansing suffering where prayers, masses, alms, and remembrance might aid the dead. This belief bound generations together. The living prayed for the dead, and hoped that one day others would pray for them. Even poverty could participate in this economy of salvation. A candle, a coin, a spoken prayer, a place in memory, a name remembered at the altar. These small offerings mattered intensely. The priest stood between village and eternity. He baptized infants, blessed marriages, heard confessions, celebrated mass, buried the dead, warned against sin, spoke over fields, and mediated the sacred. Yet priests were human, and village priests varied greatly. Some were learned, serious, and devoted. Others were poor, barely educated, careless, greedy, or too close to the habits of their flock. A priest might drink, quarrel, father children, neglect duties, or become the subject of gossip. Sacred office did not erase human weakness. Still, the sacraments carried enormous force. Baptism rescued the newborn from spiritual danger. Confession allowed sins to be named and forgiven. Marriage shaped households and inheritance. The Mass brought the divine into the parish through ritual mystery. Extreme unction, given near death, helped prepare the soul for its passage. These rites marked the fragile thresholds of peasant existence: birth, desire, guilt, illness, dying. None stood outside the reach of the church, but peasant faith was not only official doctrine. It lived in wells, trees, crossroads, charms, blessings, relics, pilgrim badges, holy days, and whispered remedies. A village might honour a local saint with special devotion. A chapel might be visited for healing. A spring might be believed to help sore eyes, fever, fertility, or lameness. A mother might place trust in both a prayer and an herb. A herdsman might cross himself against storm. A traveller might fear spirits near a ruined place after dark. The boundary between religion and folk practice was often blurred. Learned churchmen sometimes condemned charms, divination, magic, and lingering customs they considered dangerous. Yet for the poor, practical fear drove many acts. If a cow stopped giving milk, if a child wasted away, if butter would not churn, if crops failed despite labour, explanations were needed. The world was crowded with forces: God, saints, demons, witches, curses, envy, weather, sin, and chance all competed in the human mind. In poverty, misfortune demanded meaning. A storm was not simply air and water. It might be judgment, trial, warning, or mystery. Disease was not merely infection. It might be punishment, demonic assault, bad air, divine testing, or the hidden working of corruption. Modern categories separate material and spiritual causes. Medieval villagers often held them together. A fever could require broth, herbs, prayer, confession, and a vow to a saint. Hope used every tool available. The churchyard was one of the most powerful places in village life. There lay parents, children, grandparents, neighbours, enemies, victims of fever, women lost in childbirth, men broken by labour, infants who never spoke, old widows who remembered names no one else knew. The dead were not far away in some distant cemetery. They rested beside the church that the living entered again and again. To pass through that ground was to move among one's own future. Bones beneath grass reminded the village that all labour ended there. Funerals carried grief into ritual. The body was washed, wrapped, carried, prayed over, and committed to consecrated earth. The community gathered because death was never only private. It affected labour, inheritance, marriage prospects, debts, tenancy, and memory. But beyond these practical matters, death stirred terror. Had the person confessed? Had restitution been made? Would the soul suffer? Would prayers be said? Would the living remember? Feast days offered brightness in a hard life. Candles, bells, ale, special food, music, games, processions, greenery, dancing, and release from ordinary routine gave the year moments of colour. The poor did not live only in grey misery. They celebrated when they could, sometimes with an intensity born from knowing how temporary joy might be. A saint's day could transform a village lane into a place of laughter, flirtation, drunkenness, devotion, and dispute all at once. Lent brought a different mood. Fasting, restraint, confession, and reflection pressed the body and soul together. For those already poor, religious fasting could feel less like sacrifice than confirmation of ordinary hardship. Yet ritual deprivation gave hunger a sacred frame. To go without could become participation in divine suffering, at least in teaching, even if the stomach knew no theology. Faith also protected social order. Sermons could urge obedience, humility, patience, charity, proper marriage, honest labour, and acceptance of one's place. Lords benefited from a religion that told the poor to endure, but the same faith could also trouble the powerful. The gospel honoured the humble, warned the rich, praised mercy, and promised that earthly status would not decide eternal fate. A peasant could kneel beneath a lord in this world and still imagine a judgment where all souls stood naked before God. That thought had power, not always revolutionary power, often consoling power, sometimes dangerous power. The belief that God saw the poor, that injustice was remembered, that suffering was not meaningless, could help a person survive what no human court would correct. Faith gave language to grief. It gave ritual to fear. It gave the dead a road. It gave the hungry a heaven where hunger ended. At night, when wind moved through thatch and the last fire sank low, prayer could become the final defence. A prayer for bread, a prayer for rain, a prayer against fever, a prayer for a husband in debt, a prayer for a daughter in childbirth, a prayer for a cow near calving, a prayer for the soul of a child buried under wet grass. In such moments, faith was not an abstract system imposed from above. It was breath offered into darkness. The medieval peasant endured a world of uncertainty, and faith made uncertainty habitable. Not safe, not simple, habitable. It turned fear into ritual, suffering into story, death into passage, and poverty into something witnessed by heaven. Whether every prayer was answered was another matter, answerless, adrift to ponder. Yet still the bell rang, the candles burned, the priest lifted his hands, the people knelt, and the village placed its hunger, hope, sin, grief, and longing beneath the gaze of eternity. The peasant body was an archive of hardship, not an archive of parchment, ink, seals, and careful handwriting, but one of bone, tooth, scar, posture, and pain. Long after a cottage collapsed into soil and a name vanished from memory, the body could still speak. It spoke in worn joints, curved spines, broken ribs, healed fractures, infected teeth, shortened limbs, and lines of stress left in childhood enamel. Poverty entered the body slowly, meal by meal, winter by winter, task by task, until flesh itself became a record of survival. Medieval peasants did not merely live with discomfort. They lived inside it. Aching was ordinary. Stiffness was ordinary. Cold hands, sore backs, cracked skin, smoke-reddened eyes, tooth pain, lice, fleas, coughs, stomach trouble, and infected cuts belonged to the background music of life. The modern expectation that pain should be treated quickly, isolated, named, and relieved would have seemed impossible in a village where work could not pause simply because the body protested. A person laboured until they could not, and even then, some smaller task usually waited. Bones reveal repetition. A shoulder worn by lifting, a knee damaged by bending, a spine compressed by loads carried for years, hands shaped by gripping tools, teeth ground down by coarse bread. Archaeological examination of rural cemeteries often finds signs of heavy physical stress, especially in adults who began working young and never truly stopped. These were not bodies designed for leisure. They were used hard because survival demanded use. Injury was a constant threat. A sickle could slice fingers. An axe could bite into a foot. A plough animal could crush a leg. A horse could kick. A cart could overturn. A fall from a loft, tree, wall, or wagon could break bones in a world with no reliable surgery, no antibiotics, and limited means of immobilizing damage. Some fractures healed well enough, others healed crooked. A badly set limb might leave a person limping for life, and a limp could reduce earning power, marriage prospects, and household security. Infection was often the true enemy. A small wound could redden, swell, fill with heat, and become deadly. Splinters, blisters, animal bites, burns, and blade cuts were not minor events if corruption entered the flesh. People used poultices, herbs, washing, binding, prayers, charms, and whatever experience suggested. Sometimes the body recovered, sometimes fever came, and a person who had walked to the field in the morning lay senseless by evening. Teeth were a world of suffering. Coarse flour, grit from milling stones, hard crusts, and poor dental care wore enamel down. Cavities, abscesses, lost teeth, and jaw infections could cause severe pain. A dental abscess might swell the face, poison the blood, and kill. Yet many people endured tooth pain for years, chewing on one side, avoiding hard pieces, pressing herbs against the gum, or simply bearing it because there was no better answer. The skulls of the poor often preserve this intimate misery with brutal clarity. Malnutrition did not always look like starvation. It could appear as stunted growth, weakness, poor resistance to disease, slow healing, brittle health, and exhaustion that settled into the limbs. A person might eat every day and still lack enough protein, fat, or variety. Children were especially vulnerable. A poor start in life could leave marks that shape the future body. Hunger weakened more than the stomach. It narrowed possibility. Parasites thrived in crowded worlds. This moved through hair and clothing. Fleas lived in bedding and animals. Worms entered bellies through contaminated food, soil, or water. Skin conditions spread easily where washing was limited by weather, fuel, labour, and access. The close companionship of humans and animals brought warmth and livelihood, but also insects, waste, smell, and disease. Poverty made distance difficult, and disease loved closeness. Breathing was another burden. Smoke from open hearths filled interiors day after day, especially in cold months when doors remained shut. Eyes watered, throats burned, lungs absorbed soot and irritation. A child raised in smoke, an old woman bent beside the fire, a man sleeping under a blackened roof after field labour. All breathed air that carried comfort and harm together. Fire kept people alive while quietly injuring them. Such was the logic of poverty. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous thresholds. A woman might face obstructed labour, hemorrhage, infection, exhaustion, fever, or retained afterbirth with little help beyond the skill of other women and the mercy of circumstance. Every pregnancy altered the body. Repeated births, poor nutrition, heavy work, and short recovery times increased danger. A mother might survive childbirth but be weakened for months. Another might die quickly, leaving a newborn, older children, debts, and grief in her place. Disease visited without warning, fevers, coughs, fluxes of the bowels, skin eruptions, eye infections, and mysterious swellings moved through villages in ways people struggle to explain. Bad air, divine judgment, corrupted food, imbalance, contagion, sin, witchcraft, and seasonal change all offered possible meanings. The lack of modern germ theory did not make people foolish. They observed patterns. They feared foul smells. They avoided some dangers. They knew sickness could pass from person to person. But knowledge remained incomplete, and medicine was often overwhelmed. The plague stands apart in terror, but ordinary illness killed constantly. A child with diarrhea could die from dehydration. A man with a winter cough could sink into lung disease. A woman weakened after childbirth could develop fever. An old person might not survive a hard frost. A minor epidemic could empty cottages, disrupt labour, and leave fields untended. Death did not always arrive dramatically. Often it came through weakness, bad timing, and the body's inability to continue. Care took place at home. The sick lay near the hearth, under rough coverings, sweating, shivering, muttering, praying, or staring into smoke. Family and neighbours brought broth, ale, herbs, compresses, prayers, and news. Someone changed bedding if bedding existed to change. Someone cleaned vomit or waste. Someone sat through the night. Care was intimate and exhausting. A sick body consumed labour from the healthy, and in a poor household that cost mattered. Yet the body could be resilient. People healed from fractures, survived infections, adapted to disability, worked through chronic pain, and reached old age despite hardship. Some skeletons show bodies that endured remarkable damage and continued living for years, which means communities sometimes supported the injured, the elderly, and the impaired. Poverty was harsh, but not always without compassion. A village could be cruel. It could also keep someone alive. Old age carried both weakness and authority. An elderly peasant might be bent, toothless, half-blind, and slow, but still valuable. Memory mattered. Knowledge of boundaries, seasons, marriages, quarrels, remedies, family claims, and old customs lived in older bodies. A grandmother who could no longer reap might mind children, sort food, spin, advise, remember, and warn. An old man unable to plough might mend tools, watch animals, tell stories, or speak with weight in disputes. The fragile body shaped the peasant mind. People knew life could change in an instant. Strength was respected because everyone understood its loss. Food was cherished because weakness was familiar. Health was prayed for because it could not be assumed. A sound tooth, a straight limb, a safe birth, a healed wound, a child surviving fever. These were not small mercies. They were victories. The hidden world of medieval peasants was carried inside bodies that had no choice but to continue. Body bent by labour, marked by hunger, scarred by accident, blackened by smoke, bitten by insects, strained by childbirth, shaken by fever, and still capable of love, song, anger, prayer, laughter, and work. In the end, poverty was not an idea hovering over them. It lived in muscle and marrow. It walked with them into fields, lay beside them in darkness, and followed them into the grave, where centuries later, the bones still tell the truth. Beyond the ploughed strips and cottage gardens lay another world of survival. It was the common land, the meadow, the marsh, the heath, the wood, the riverbank, the rough pasture, the hedge line, the waste ground where official ownership and daily necessity met in uneasy silence. To those with wealth, these places might look marginal, tangled, poor and disorderly. To the medieval peasant, they were cupboards without walls, medicine chests without locks, grazing grounds without which animals couldn't live, and secret maps of possibility. Common land was not empty land. It was governed by custom, memory, timing, and dispute. Villagers might hold rights to graze animals, cut turf, collect fallen wood, gather bracken, dig clay, take reeds, fish, forage, or pasture pigs beneath trees when acorns and beechnuts fell. These rights could be ancient, local, complicated, and fiercely defended. A lord might own the soil in one sense, but peasants could claim use in another. That difference mattered. In poverty, use could be as important as ownership. A cow needed grass, a pig needed mast, a hearth needed fuel, a roof needed thatch, a family needed berries, nuts, mushrooms, herbs, rushes, poles, leaves, and litter for bedding. These small resources rarely appear grand from a distance, but together they form the hidden infrastructure of peasant survival. A household without access to common resources was more exposed to hunger, cold, and debt. The poorest often depended on these edges most intensely, because they owned less land and fewer animals, and had little margin when stores ran low. The woodland was especially valuable. It was not a dark, romantic wilderness untouched by human hands. Much medieval woodland was managed, entered, cut, grazed, watched, and remembered. Coppiced trees sent up new shoots for poles and fuel. Dead branches could be gathered where custom allowed. Nuts fed pigs. Leaves became fodder or bedding. Bark, roots, flowers, and herbs found their way into remedies. Wood made handles, fences, bowls, carts, hurdles, stools, roofs, and tools. The forest was a living workshop, yet woodland could also be forbidden. Lords guarded timber, hunting rights, deer, and profit. Royal forests in some regions carried especially severe regulations, where certain animals and trees were protected not because peasants had no need of them, but because elite hunting and authority claimed priority. A starving household looking into a wood full of life might see food, fuel, and repair. A forester might see trespass, theft, and fine. Between those two visions lay conflict. Poaching was one answer, not always with dramatic bows beneath moonlight, though such things happened. More often it was subtle. Snares set in hedges, fish taken quietly, birds trapped, rabbits or hares caught where rules forbade it, wood cut beyond allowance, a deer carcass hidden, shared, denied. The line between survival and crime was drawn by power, but hunger crossed lines easily. A lord's game animal could look very different to a man whose children had not eaten meat in weeks. Peasants were not careless about risk. They knew who watched the woods. They knew which paths carried footmarks. They knew when the moon was bright, when storms muffled sound, when officials drank, when neighbours could be trusted, when silence must be purchased with a share. The hidden economy of survival depended on knowledge as much as courage. A person who stole openly was a fool. A person who survived quietly might become almost invisible. Gleaning formed another essential practice. When harvesters had carried away the sheaves, the field still held scattered ears of grain. Women, children, the elderly, and the very poor moved through the stubble, bending again and again, gathering what the main harvest had missed. Each ear looked like almost nothing. A basket full became food. This was not merely begging. In many places it was defended by custom, tolerated by necessity, and surrounded by moral expectation. The rich took the crop, the poor took what fell. Hedgerows were also larders. They gave blackberries, hips, haws, sloes, nuts, greens, herbs, eggs from hidden nests, and small animals for those bold enough to take them. Hedges marked boundaries, but they also softened them. A child could learn which berries ripened first, which thorns tore skin, which plants cured stomach pain, which leaves fed animals, which branches made decent kindling. The hedge was a teacher. It scratched lessons into the hands. Marsh and fen offered different gifts. Reeds for thatch, fish, eels, birds, eggs, peat, grazing, and wetland plants could support entire ways of the life. Such landscapes were hard, damp, insect-ridden, and often looked suspicious to outsiders, but they could feed people in ways dry fields could not. The poor understood wetlands not as wasteland, but as opportunity with mud around it. Later authorities might drain or enclose such places in the name of improvement, but for those who survived from them, improvement could mean loss. Barter helped turn fragments into sufficiency. A woman with extra eggs might exchange them for thread. A man skilled at repairing tools might receive grain. A widow might offer brewing, washing, or childcare for help with fuel. A family with a pig might trade meat for labour. A neighbour with a strong son might lend his strength at harvest in return for future assistance. Coin was useful, but not always available. Obligation, trust, memory, a need created another currency. Borrowing was part of this world. Seed borrowed before sowing, a tool borrowed for a day, an animal shared for ploughing, a pot lent, a ladder passed from cottage to cottage, a cloak pledged, a loaf given with the expectation that one day the favour would return. Such exchanges could bind a community together, but they could also create resentment. Everyone remembered who repaid and who did not. In a village, debt had a face. Secret survival could also mean concealment, a little grain hidden from assessment, a chicken not mentioned, a patch of beans quietly planted, a child sent to gather fuel from a place technically forbidden, a brewing batch sold without full attention from officials, a boundary stone shifted slightly, a few extra animals grazed on common pasture. These were not always acts of rebellion in a grand sense. They were adjustments made by people who understood that strict obedience could starve them. The poor survived through layers: official land, common right, family labour, women's skill, children's gathering, seasonal foraging, neighbourly exchange, hidden taking, prayer, luck. Each layer was thin. Together they could hold. Remove too many, and a household collapsed into hunger, debt, flight, or dependence. This is why common rights were defended so fiercely. To outsiders, a dispute over a path, a pasture, a fallen branch, or a few gleaned ears might seem petty. To villagers, such things touched life itself. A lost right to gather wood meant colder nights. A closed pasture meant fewer animals. A forbidden marsh meant less food. A stricter forest official meant more fines. Poverty made small rights enormous. In the hidden world of medieval peasants, survival did not come only from the field under the open sky. It came from the edge places, the overlooked places, the thorny places, the damp places. The places where a hand could still reach for something not yet taken by rent, tithe, lord, or market. The poor knew that life might depend on a hedge, a handful of acorns, a stream after dusk, a neighbour's silence, or the right to bend over stubble and gather what remained. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The baskets rotted, the snares vanished, the whispered bargains left no parchment, the footprints faded from the wood path after rain. Yet somewhere in those vanished acts, medieval peasants found the difference between hunger and endurance, between obedience and survival, between the world they were given and the world they quietly made for themselves. Justice in the medieval village did not always arrive wearing a crown. More often it came through a gathering of neighbours, a steward seated with authority, a reeve speaking what he knew, tenants standing in watchful silence, and names called aloud before people who remembered every fence, quarrel, marriage, debt, insult, and missing animal. Law was not distant. It lived in the lane, the field, the alehouse, the churchyard, the open court, and the long memory of those who had seen too much to be easily deceived. The manor court was one of the central stages of peasant life. Here, the ordinary world became official. A pig had broken into another man's beans. A ditch had not been cleared. A widow claimed her husband's holding. A daughter had married without permission. Someone had brewed ale below the required measure. Someone had cut wood where they should not. Someone had failed to come when summoned. Someone had struck a neighbour with a staff. Someone had let animals wander through the Lord's grain. These sound like small matters. They were not small. In a world where one animal could destroy weeks of labour, where a blocked ditch could drown a crop, where a boundary mistake could reduce a family's food, where a marriage could alter inheritance and labour, small disputes carried real force. The manor court existed partly to protect lordly interest, but it also helped regulate the village's own survival. It turned memory into judgment. It gave shape to grievance. It punished disorder before disorder became feud. Custom mattered as much as command. The lord might own the manor, but he could not always invent new rules without challenge. Villagers knew what had been done in the time of fathers and grandfathers. They knew which dues were ancient, which services were expected, which pastures opened on certain days, which paths were public, which fines were tolerable, and which demands smelled of overreach. In court, memory could become resistance. A peasant might not defeat power, but he could slow it, complicate it, force it to speak in the language of precedent. The court was also theatre. People watched who stood confidently and who trembled. They heard accusations, excuses, denials, oaths, and evasions. A reputation could rise or fall there. The dishonest miller, the careless herdsman, the quarrelsome woman, the violent husband, the unreliable borrower, the stubborn widow, the ambitious tenant, all appeared not as abstract figures, but as known bodies standing among neighbours. Public judgment gave law its sting. Shame could hurt almost as much as a fine. Women appeared often in this world of village justice. They were accused of brewing offences, scolding, fighting, trespass, debt, sexual misconduct, and small thefts. They also made claims, defended property, reported wrongs, and stood as widows managing land. The court did not make them equal to men, but it did not erase them either. Their words mattered, especially when tied to household survival, reputation, or custom. A woman who knew how to speak, whom to support, and when to appear wronged, could use the machinery of judgment with skill. Gossip served as another court. Long before an accusation reached a formal gathering, It travelled through doorways, wells, fields, ovens, and brewing benches. Gossip could warn, punish, investigate, or destroy. It told the village who'd been seen near the hedge at dusk, who watered the ale too much, who beat his wife, who neglected animals, who took more than their share, who met whom behind the barn, who owed money, who had hidden grain, who had insulted kin. In crowded poverty, privacy was thin, and talk filled the gaps law could not reach. But gossip was dangerous because it did not always need proof. A rumour could cling, a young woman's marriage prospects might suffer from whispers. A poor man might be suspected simply because he was desperate. A widow without strong kin might be vulnerable to accusation. A newcomer could be watched with suspicion. The village community could protect, but it could also suffocate. To live among people who knew everything was both safety and prison. Punishment ranged from fines to humiliation. Most offences ended with money owed, goods surrendered, promises made, or duties enforced, yet public shame had its own rituals. Some communities used stocks, pillories, or other visible punishments for disorderly behaviour. To be displayed before neighbours was to have the body turned into a warning. The punishment didn't end when the device was removed. It continued in laughter, memory, and nickname. Violence was part of village life, not constant chaos, but present enough to be familiar. Men fought over land, honour, ale, animals, women, debts, and insults. Women fought too, sometimes with words, sometimes with fists, nails, stones, or household objects. Blood could be drawn in lanes and fields. A staff, knife, flail, or tool might become a weapon in anger. The same people who depended on one another could wound one another. Community did not mean peace. It meant unavoidable entanglement. Theft revealed the moral pressure of poverty. Stealing grain, cloth, tools, animals, firewood, or food was condemned, yet everyone understood need. A hungry person might take because hunger had narrowed the mind to one point. A neighbour might accuse because their own survival had been threatened. Mercy and anger wrestled in such cases. A stolen loaf was never only a loaf, it was labour, scarcity, fear, and the question of who deserved to endure. Oaths carried great weight. In a world where written evidence was limited, sworn words mattered. To swear falsely invited not only legal risk but spiritual danger. God was imagined as witness. Saints could be invoked. Relics, altars, and sacred spaces gave speech a force beyond ordinary promise. Yet people still lied. They shaded truth, forgot conveniently, stood with kin, protected allies, and accused enemies. The sacred did not remove human calculation, it raised the stakes. The reeve occupied a difficult position. Often drawn from the peasantry, he helped manage the manor's business, organise labour, collect dues, and report failures. This made him useful to the lord and resented by neighbours. He knew who was late, who was weak, who was hiding, who had animals, who owed work. His authority came from within the village but served power above it. Such men walked a narrow path, never fully trusted by either side. Justice also depended on memory of land. Boundary disputes could last generations. A ridge, tree, stone, ditch, path, or stream might become the focus of bitter argument. Land was not merely property, it was bred in future form. To lose a strip, a meadow right, or access to pasture could damage children not yet born. Old people became valuable witnesses because they remembered where things had stood before floods, clearings, marriages, and deaths changed the pattern. Marriage disputes exposed the village's deepest anxieties: promises, betrothals, consent, pregnancy, inheritance, dowries, and sexual reputation all drew legal and communal attention. A secret promise could become a public battle. A pregnancy could force negotiations. A broken arrangement could damage families. Love, desire, property, labour, and honour tangled together. No marriage belonged only to two people. The whole village had an interest in where bodies, land, and future children would go. Peasant justice was imperfect, biased, intimate, and often harsh. It could defend the weak, but it could also crush them. It could restrain lordly overreach, but it also enforced lordly rights. It could preserve custom, but custom itself might be unequal. It gave villagers a voice, but not always the same voice. The wealthy tenant, the respected elder, the man with kin, the woman with reputation, the skilled speaker, each stood differently from the landless labourer, the servant, the stranger, or the shamed. Still, within this complicated world, peasants were not silent objects of rule. They argued, they remembered, they accused, they negotiated, they used courts when useful and avoided them when dangerous. They shaped justice through testimony, custom, alliance, and pressure. Their world was governed not only by written law, but by the living law of proximity, where every act might be seen, every debt remembered, every kindness stored, and every insult carried forward like a coal under ash. Village justice was the sound of poverty organising itself against collapse. It was messy because life was messy. It was personal because survival was personal. It was watchful because nothing could be wasted. Not land, not labour, not reputation, not trust. Beneath the formal authority of lord, steward, and court lay something older and harder to name. A community struggling to keep order among people who needed one another, resented one another, feared one another, and could not easily escape one another. Anger in the medieval village did not always shout. Often it waited. It waited in a man forced to leave his own field to work another's land. It waited in a widow fined when grief had already emptied her house. It waited in the boy watching grain carried away from the household store. It waited in the woman measuring flour after tithe and rent had taken their portions. It waited in the tenant who remembered older customs and saw them tightened by men with ledgers, seals, and sharper appetites. Peasant life was built upon endurance, but endurance was not the same as consent. The poor could appear obedient while carrying a private history of injuries. A fine too high, a pasture closed, a woodland right denied, a tax demanded for a war no villager had chosen, a steward who mocked the desperate, a lord who forgot that custom was not merely his command. Every pressure left a mark. Most marks faded into ordinary resentment. Some joined together, some hardened. Rebellion rarely began as a dream of remaking the world. It began with limits. There was only so much grain to surrender, only so many days to lose, only so many insults to swallow, only so many old rights to see narrowed before memory became accusation. A peasant might accept hierarchy as part of the world, yet still believe that hierarchy had rules. Lords should protect, priests should guide, kings should be just, officials should not devour the poor beyond measure. When those expectations broke, anger could clothe itself in moral certainty. Much resistance remained small. A labour service performed slowly. Tools brought late, animals hidden from counting, rents delayed, orders misunderstood, wood taken under cover of darkness, a court summons ignored, a path used despite prohibition, grain concealed beneath straw. These acts did not overturn lordship, but they mattered. They were the daily friction by which the poor defended fragments of life. Power demanded smooth obedience. Peasants gave it mud. Sometimes the village acted together. A whole community might refuse an unfamiliar demand, deny an official's claim, or insist that no such duty had ever existed. Collective memory became a shield. No single poor tenant could easily stand alone, but many voices saying the same thing could create difficulty. Authority often depended on records, but local truth depended on people willing to repeat it. In such moments, the village itself became an archive with clenched teeth. Anger could gather around taxes. Taxation from distant rulers was especially dangerous because it lacked the intimacy of custom. The peasant knew the lord, resented him, feared him, perhaps bargained with him, perhaps even saw him at certain rituals or courts. But a royal tax for war, ransom, administration, or ambition could seem like hunger sent from a place beyond the horizon. Collectors arrived with authority, but not necessarily legitimacy in the eyes of those who paid. War deepened resentment. Armies consumed. Soldiers took food, animals, carts, lodging, and labour. Fields were trampled, mills burned. Villages caught between forces suffered no matter which banner claimed justice. A king's glory might appear in songs, but in the countryside it could arrive as a requisitioned horse, a stolen pig, a daughter hidden from armed men, a barn emptied in the name of necessity. The poor often paid for victories they never saw. Rumour helped rebellion move. News travelled by market, pilgrimage, labour migration, wandering priests, discharged soldiers, merchants, servants, beggars, and kin. A village heard that others had refused. Another heard that records had been burned. Another heard that the king would forgive them if only evil advisers were removed. Rumour didn't need perfect accuracy to be powerful. It gave shape to hope. It told the isolated that they were not alone. When peasants rose, they often attacked documents. This was no accident. Charters, court rolls, rent records, debt lists, and manorial accounts held the written memory of obligation. To destroy them was to strike at the machinery that made inequality permanent. Fire-consuming parchment could feel like time itself being loosened. If the record vanished, perhaps the dew vanished. If the proof burned, perhaps freedom could be spoken into being. Such acts reveal that peasants understood power with cold clarity. They knew where it was stored. They also attacked symbols, manor houses, tax offices, mills, prisons, gates, officials, sometimes clergy, sometimes lawyers, sometimes anyone seen as feeding upon the poor through paper, speech, or office. Rebellion did not always distinguish carefully once fear and fury took hold. Long humiliation can make justice burn too hot. A crowd that begins by demanding fairness may end by spilling blood. Yet peasant rebels were not mindless mobs. They could organise, negotiate, issue demands, choose leaders, swear oaths, march under banners, and appeal to ideals of justice older than their oppressors wished to admit. They might call for the end of serfdom, reduction of dues, punishment of corrupt officials, restoration of custom, or recognition of ancient freedoms. Their language often drew from faith, law, and memory. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as correcting a world gone crooked. The powerful feared this deeply. A peasant alone was manageable. A village united was troublesome. Many villages moving together became nightmare. The medieval order rested on the labour of the many and the command of the few. Rebellion exposed that uncomfortable truth. The people who fed society could also stop feeding it. The people who carried stones could pull them down. The people who bowed could stand. Repression was usually brutal. Promises might be made in the heat of crisis, then withdrawn when armed power returned. Leaders could be executed, villages fined, rights restricted, bodies displayed as warnings. The machinery of order reassembled itself around punishment. Chronicles written by elites often described rebels as wicked, foolish, animalistic, or deceived. Such descriptions reveal fear as much as fact. The poor, when organized, disturbed the moral imagination of those who depended on their submission. But even failed rebellions left traces. They taught lords caution. They taught officials that extraction had limits. They taught peasants stories of courage and betrayal. They entered songs, rumours, family memories, and warnings spoken by hearths. The dead did not always win what they demanded, but they changed what could be imagined. Somewhere, a child heard that ordinary people had once marched against men in power, and the thought remained. The deeper rebellion was perhaps psychological. Poverty tried to teach the poor that their suffering was natural, that dues were eternal, that hunger was deserved, that obedience was the only safe road. Yet beneath that teaching lived another knowledge, born from labour itself. Peasants knew the world depended on them. They knew fields did not plough themselves, bread did not bake itself, barns did not fill themselves, and armies did not eat honour. They knew, even if quietly, that the high rested upon the low. This knowledge could sleep for generations. Then a tax, a famine, a plague, a harsh lord, a rumour, a sermon, or a single insult could wake it. Not every village burned. Not every tenant resisted. Many feared revolt with good reason, because the cost could be terrible. A household with children might prefer survival under injustice to death beneath a rebel banner. Caution was not cowardice. It was another form of intelligence. Still, the possibility of uprising lived inside the system like a buried ember. Peasant rebellion was not separate from poverty. It was one of poverty's languages. When all other speech failed, when petitions vanished, when custom was mocked, when hunger sharpened the room and officials still demanded more, anger found other tools, staffs, sickles, axes, fire, oaths, crowds, bells rung in alarm, roads filled with feet. For a moment, the hidden world became visible. The people of mud and field stepped onto the stage of history, not as background, but as force. And then, often, silence returned. The records resumed. The rents were collected. The courts sat again. The fields needed sowing. The widows counted losses. The executed were remembered in whispers. Yet power had seen what lay beneath the surface, and the poor had seen it too. A village could kneel for 1,000 mornings, but somewhere in the kneeling it never entirely forgot how to rise. Death came first as rumour, a sickness in a port town, a village emptied along a road, a monastery where the bells would not stop, merchants whispering of swollen bodies, travellers speaking of carts filled with the dead, priests called from house to house until they too vanished. At first, such stories may have seemed like distant terror, the kind of darkness that belonged elsewhere, beyond the next market, beyond the river, beyond the known fields. Then it arrived. The great pestilence moved through the medieval world with a speed and cruelty that stunned even people long accustomed to loss. It entered towns, manors, hamlets, farms, monasteries, castles, ports, and inland valleys. It did not respect rank, but it did not strike all lives equally either. The poor were crowded, underfed, exposed, and dependent on one another for care. A sickness that thrived on closeness found countless doors already open. In the village, the first death changed the air. A neighbour who had shared tools, a child who had chased geese, a woman known for brewing, a man who owed labour next week. One body became several, several became many. The familiar map of the community began to fail. Doors remained shut. Smoke stopped rising from certain roofs. Animals bawled unattended. Fields waited for hands that would not return. The churchyard received more than memory could easily hold. Fear became physical. People watched for swellings. fever, dark marks, coughing, weakness, sudden collapse. A headache could become dread, a flea bite could become prophecy, a warm forehead could empty a household of hope. Care itself became decorous, yet abandonment was unthinkable for many. Mothers tended children, husbands lifted wives, neighbours brought water, food, prayers, and sometimes courage they did not feel. Love carried people toward the sick even when fear begged them to stay away. The priest's role became unbearable. He was called to hear confession, administer last rites, bury bodies, comfort survivors, and explain what no one could truly understand. Some priests stayed until death took them, some fled, some villages lost their spiritual shepherds at the moment when terror most needed ritual. Without enough clergy, the old order of death itself strained and cracked. Bodies could not always receive the rites people desired. Graves might be hurried. Mourning became compressed by necessity. Labour collapsed. A household struck by death could not plough, reap, brew, mend, milk, or pay as before. A manor losing tenants lost rent and service. Oxen survived without drivers. Grain stood uncut. Hay rotted. Mills lacked customers. Workshops lacked hands. The dead did not merely leave emotional absence. They tore holes in the structure of production. The medieval economy, built upon human labour in overwhelming measure, suddenly discovered how much each body had mattered. For survivors, grief mixed with opportunity in ways that could feel almost sinful. Land fell vacant. Wages rose in some places. Lords needed workers. Tenants could bargain. Servants could demand better terms. A man who had once accepted fixed conditions might now walk away. A woman who inherited land through layers of death might hold unexpected power. Families once crowded onto small holdings found empty acres nearby. The plague did not create justice, but it disrupted certainty. The old world tried to defend itself. Authorities sought to control wages, restrict movement, enforce labour obligations, and preserve the hierarchy that death had shaken. Laws could declare what workers should be paid, where they should serve, how they should behave. But law spoken from above now faced a countryside where survivors knew their value. A ploughman could look at untilled land and understand the truth. Without hands, commands were wind. This change entered the mind. For generations, poverty had trained peasants to think of scarcity as their weakness. Too many mouths, too little land, too few choices. The pestilence reversed the pressure. Now there were, in many places, too few workers for the demands of the powerful. This did not make life easy. Grief was everywhere. Villages were scarred. Children were orphaned. Families were broken. But bargaining power, once almost unimaginable for the lowest, began to appear in cracks opened by catastrophe. Mobility increased. Some peasants left manors where obligations remained harsh and sought better terms elsewhere. Towns needed labour. Lords competed quietly despite legal restrictions. Servants moved in search of wages. Young people delayed or reshaped marriage plans. Old holdings changed hands. The landscape of dependence shifted, not everywhere at the same pace, not without resistance, but enough to unsettle assumptions that had seemed older than memory. The change was not only economic. Death altered spiritual confidence. If plague had struck priests, nobles, merchants, children, sinners, and the devout alike, what did that mean? Some turned deeper into faith, penance, processions, and devotion. Some sought scapegoats. Some questioned the moral structure of the world. Some simply endured, too exhausted for philosophy. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden, for the inner thoughts of the poor rarely reached parchment. Yet a society that had watched half a village disappear could not remain untouched in its soul. The household reorganized around loss. A widower remarried quickly because children needed care and work demanded partnership. A widow took in kin or servants. Orphans were absorbed by relatives when possible, hired out, apprenticed, neglected, or left vulnerable. Land might pass in unexpected ways. Goods were redistributed, tools found new hands, clothing of the dead was worn by the living. Memory was practical. The dead remained present in the objects they left behind. The body count also changed the meaning of land. Where once families had struggled to survive on small holdings, vacant plots allowed some to expand. Better diet may have followed for certain survivors, with access to more pasture, animals, and grain. Meat consumption increased in some regions. Wages improved for labourers able to sell their strength. Poverty did not vanish, but its boundaries shifted. A peasant might still be poor, yet less trapped than a grandparent had been. Lords adapted. Some converted arable land to pasture, requiring fewer workers. Some leased domain lands rather than directly managing them. Some commuted labour services into money rents. Some tightened control where possible. Some failed. The manor did not disappear in a single dramatic collapse, but its older forms weakened in many places. Custom, labour, cash, and negotiation rearranged themselves under pressure from demographic disaster. The survivor carried an impossible inheritance. They had seen horror beyond ordinary famine, beyond local sickness, beyond personal grief. They had watched the machinery of society falter because too many ordinary people were gone. They had learned that the powerful could be frightened. They had learned that labour had a price. They had learned that the old duties could be questioned when the field stood empty. Such knowledge could not be entirely buried again. Yet there was no simple liberation. New burdens emerged. Authorities punished wage demands. Landless people still struggled. Women could gain opportunities and face renewed restrictions. Orphans remained exposed. War, taxation, bad harvests, and disease continued. The plague opened doors, but not all could pass through them. History rarely hands freedom whole. It offers broken tools in a ruined room and asks the living what they can make. Some villages never fully recovered. House sites emptied. Fields reverted to pasture or scrub. Churches served smaller congregations. Paths faded. The earth slowly folded over the outlines of homes. In deserted settlements, stratigraphic excavation would one day find pottery shards, post holes, hearths, and abandoned boundaries, mute traces of communities thinned by death, economics, and changing land use. The silence of such places is not empty. It is crowded with absence, and yet life continued. Children were born into villages where elders remembered the great mortality in lowered voices. Weddings returned, markets reopened, fields were sown. Bells rang again for reasons other than burial. People laughed, quarrelled, brewed, prayed, harvested, and negotiated. The human world, shattered, began its slow work of reassembling itself. The plague had revealed a truth hidden beneath centuries of hierarchy. The poor were not surplus. They were the foundation. When they died, the field stopped. When they survived, they could bargain. When they moved, lords worried. When they demanded wages, governments responded. When they remembered catastrophe, they carried a new understanding of their place in the world. Out of death came not triumph, but alteration. A changed balance, a changed confidence, a changed road through the last centuries of the Middle Ages. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, but the bones, the court records, the empty villages, and the stubborn persistence of rural life all point toward the same vast transformation. In the wake of plague, Medieval peasants did not cease to be poor. They did not suddenly become free in every field and valley. But the world around them had been wounded so deeply that even power had to limp, and in that limp the poor found room to breathe. The medieval peasant left almost nothing that power was trained to admire. No golden crown, no marble tomb, no jewelled sword placed beneath a vaulted chapel, no illuminated book signed with a proud hand, no great hall bearing a family crest, no triumphal inscription declaring conquest over enemies. The poor passed through the world with wooden tools, patched garments, clay pots, iron knives, baskets, seed sacks, and tired animals. Most of what they touched was used until it broke, burned, rotted, rusted, or returned to soil. And yet their shadow is everywhere. It lies beneath the old field systems still visible in certain landscapes, where ridges and furrows ripple under grass like waves from a vanished sea. It lingers in parish boundaries, footpaths, village names, hedgerows, churchyards, and market towns whose origins belong not to kings alone, but to the daily movement of ordinary feet. It rests in the foundations of cottages long gone, in the dark stains of hearths, in broken cooking pots, in animal bones, in seed remains, in the worn teeth and bent spines lifted carefully from consecrated earth. The peasant world did not vanish cleanly. It changed. It endured. It was enclosed, taxed, commercialized, reformed, disrupted, romanticized, mocked, and forgotten. Fields once worked in these strips became hedged farms. Common rights were narrowed or taken. Villages grew into towns, or shrank into grass-covered earthworks. Old obligations disappeared in one place and survived in another. Money deepened its reach. Markets expanded. Wages, rents, contracts, and laws changed the language of dependence. But the central struggle remained recognizable across centuries. How ordinary people survive when the world demands more from them than it gives back. There is a danger in looking at medieval peasants only through suffering. If all we see is hunger, filth, disease, and oppression, we make them smaller than they were. We turn living people into symbols of misery. But there is an equal danger in turning them into rustic heroes, smiling beneath thatch, content with simple bread, singing in golden fields untouched by fear. That, too, is false. They were neither beasts of burden nor figures from a lost paradise. They were human beings, intelligent, flawed, tender, suspicious, devout, angry, funny, practical, cruel at times, generous at others, and always more complicated than the records allow. They survived because they knew things. They knew weather not as conversation, but as fate written in cloud, frost, wind, insect, and soil. They knew hunger's calendar. They knew the moral weight of a shared loaf. They knew that a neighbour might become saviour or accuser. They knew how to judge seed by hand, ale by smell, wool by touch, sickness by heat, land by memory, and danger by silence. They knew when to bow, when to argue, when to hide, when to share, when to endure, and when endurance had become another name for surrender. Their knowledge was not primitive. It was local, embodied, inherited, tested, and revised under pressure. The modern world often respects knowledge when it is written, measured, certified, and stored in institutions. Medieval peasant knowledge lived in muscles, kitchens, fields, songs, scars, tools, and repeated acts. It was not always correct. It could be bound by fear, rumour, and superstition, but it was also precise in ways that mattered. A family that misread the season could starve. A village that forgot its rights could lose them. A woman who mismanaged food stores might face winter terror. A man who mishandled an animal could ruin a household. Their poverty was material, but it was never empty. It contained strategies, It contained memory. It contained ceremony, laughter, resentment, faith, and skill. It contained the small economies of eggs, ale, gleaned grain, borrowed tools, hidden wood, favours, gossip, and obligation. It contained the dignity of persistence, though dignity did not soften the ground beneath their feet or fill the pot when grain ran out. In the long road of human history, the medieval peasant stands close to us and far away at the same time. Far away because their world was structured by lordship, tithe, manor, open field, sacred fear, and a closeness to death that many modern lives rarely experience so constantly. Close, because the questions beneath their lives have not disappeared. How does a family endure insecurity? How does a community share scarcity? How does labour become invisible to those who benefit from it? How do the poor preserve dignity under systems that measure them only when payment is due? How much can people bear before quiet suffering becomes open refusal? These are not dead questions. They follow humanity like footprints through mud. The peasant reminds us that civilization is not built only by those whose names survive. It is built by those who wake early, carry water, mend what breaks, feed children, tend animals, save seed, bury loved ones, and return to work while history looks elsewhere. The great towers of the medieval world, the castles, cathedrals, monasteries, markets, walls, roads, and royal ambitions, all rested upon countless lives that rarely entered the page except as rent, labour, fine, tithe, or number. But archaeology has changed the silence. A rubbish pit becomes testimony, a skeleton becomes biography, a deserted village become a library of earth. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic excavation, isotopic analysis, paleopathology, landscape archaeology, and careful study of humble objects allow the poor to speak without words, not clearly, not completely. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden, but enough survives to challenge the old habit of seeing history from the high window of power. Look down, and the ground is full of lives. A child's lost bead, a woman's spindle whirl, a cracked cooking pot blackened by fire, a knife sharpened until the blade grew thin, a horseshoe, a pig bone, a seed charred in a hearth, a grave where the joints show labour, the teeth show grit, and the skull once held a mind as alive and searching as our own. These are not small things. They are the ruins of endurance. The legacy of the medieval peasant is not a single monument. It is the persistence of ordinary life under extraordinary constraint. It is the refusal of hunger to erase affection. It is the ability of communities to organize survival from fragments. It is the memory that people can be poor without being simple, oppressed without being passive, religious without being foolish, unlettered without being unintelligent, and forgotten without being insignificant. Somewhere, even now, the old village lanes lie beneath modern roads. The fields have changed shape. The bells ring differently, or not at all. The cottages have fallen. The names are gone. Yet the human truth remains close enough to touch. A family around a fire, a body tired from work, a mother measuring food, a child learning fear and play together, an old person remembering where the boundary used to stand, a community watching the sky, and we are left, answerless, adrift to ponder. What would we have done in their place? How much hardship would we mistake for destiny? How much injustice would we call custom? How many small acts of courage would pass unnoticed because no one wrote them down? Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. More bones will be studied. More villages will be excavated. More records will be read against the grain. More hidden lives will rise, not from legend, but from soil, revealing again that the past was never empty beneath the feet of the powerful. The medieval peasant survived poverty not through one miracle, but through thousands of small continuities: bread saved, fuel gathered, ale brewed, rites remembered, children taught, tools mended, prayers spoken, anger banked, bodies spent, hope carried. And in that long endurance, they left us something greater than treasure. They left proof that the human story has always depended most on those who are least likely to be remembered. End of script. Good night.